Allow me to show you something.
Excited to have you join. Firstly, as a friend of now 10 years. For those of you that don't know, Linda and I actually lived overseas together, so we became friends in Sydney. And Linda introduced me to my first roommate in San Francisco and brought me over to Zendesk. And so we have plenty of years of funny stories and professional experiences working together as well. And so Linda was recruited and joined Slack as the first person to really champion customer success and the definition of customer success at Slack. And as we know, Slack was primarily a self-serve product and very consistent to a lot of the things that the teams on the call are thinking about today. And so the question a lot of times is, how do you take a really great self-serve product? How do you take a wait list or product hunt launch or like early strong signals from the SaaS community? And at what point do you start really layering in more systematic programs for customer success? And so I'm excited to compare notes with you. We'll have questions throughout, but assume mostly everyone has a great self-serve product. They have some distribution, and now's the time to start thinking about at what point do you hire your first head of customer success? What are the KPIs? How do you structure it? What's sort of an initial customer health score and things like that to get early stage companies started?
Awesome. All great questions.
Do you want to do just a quick background? Because I'm sure I glossed over many things. It'd be great to hear some of the early things that you worked on at Slack and sort of what that team structure looked like as the company started to evolve.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here and spending this hour with me. I'm delighted to meet all of you. And hopefully we can make this interactive, so it's not an hour of me just talking and commenting at you. But super excited to be invited to share some thoughts I have on CL. Just a quick kind of background on me. I've spent the last 12 years in post-sales world and have had on various teams from client growth and client sales teams to renewal teams to account management teams. Most recently leading corporate and mid-market account management at Zendesk, where we both worked. And then after that, moving on to Slack, where I helped build out the CS function. So to your question on some of the components of what my team was responsible for at Slack, we had a team called Strategic Programs that I led. And basically what we wanted to do, because we knew that the scale and the trajectory of Slack was pretty immense in our customer base. You know, we're really fortunate to have a huge customer base, both down market and up market. We wanted to centralize the strategy, the playbooks for our field CSM, and really just empower them to be able to be in the field doing their best work with their customers. And we also wanted to have consistency in our customers' experience, regardless of if they were being supported by a professional services team out of Japan, if they were being supported out of a partner team out of New York, if they were being supported by a scale CSM out of Austin or high touch CSM out of London. And so as we thought about kind of global scale, it became really important for us to centralize this. So my team basically supported our high touch, scale, renewal, and post-serve teams, which were our main building blocks of CS, and led any top-line initiatives, projects, programs, and owned our RCS methodology. The other component that we own, which I'm going to talk a little bit more later, is anything cross-functional. And everything in the world of CS is cross-functional because the SMs are the quarterback of the customer internally. So one of those things that is really, really important is the voice of the customer programs and the relationship between really the go-to-market team and the product and engineering teams.
That's awesome. Looking back at sort of the early, maybe even 30, 60, 90 days at Slack, how did you think about structuring the team, or what was basically an early analysis or the foundational research and work that you did before you started to build out some of those core programs?
Yeah, absolutely. to kind of zoom out, because I think where Slack is as a CS team now is not where we were, 5 years ago when we were a much smaller team and just kind of thinking about this, and CS was really still an idea. So now CS is all that fancy structure I talked about, all these centralized strategy teams, and I think around 300 CSMs at this point. But just 5 years ago, we were one person, and we were without any tooling. We didn't even have Salesforce, if you can believe it. So I got like a Slack post, if anyone actually uses Slack post or a power user, a Slack post of some big names. And it was like, oh, we have, Walmart and IBM and these big customers, but we didn't even have a CRM. So that's how scrappy we were. And I say that to say that's okay to start scrappy. And I think a lot of actually early CS teams, you do keep really scrappy because as your product forms and as your go-to-market motion forms, a lot of things develop. And so sometimes you don't want to automate or build for scale too quickly. In some ways, it's healthy for your CS team to be really scrappy early. So those early, 30, 60, 90 days felt really scrappy. But as we thought about how to build up a team structure, you have to think about what your customers need are, and then what's the most efficient way you can support that, right? So the way we kind of structured it, if you think about all those teams I mentioned, they didn't come all at once. That was more of something that happened incrementally over time. And for our pacing, that happened almost about every 6 months on the head. We would kind of really flip and grow the CS team and really change the face of CS altogether. And that was just a result of the pacing we needed for the scale we were facing. And so we started with a team that was a little bit ambiguous. They supported all customers of all sizes, we didn't have segmentation. Then, 6 months later, we moved to having it be a high touch team. Then we added our scale motion for our pool customer base. Then we added on our renewables team at a later stage, and then our ProServe team at a later stage. So all these things were kind of building blocks that happened over the course of time, but really it was indicative of what we were seeing in the customer base and how we needed to pivot to support them best.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the customer base. What's interesting in the early stages is what I'm seeing more and more today is that companies are starting more in a closed beta. And so they're partnering with a handful of customers. Maybe there's a wait list and, there's sort of lead gen that's coming to the product and there's demand for the product. How do you typically encourage startups to think about, are there systematic programs to support even individuals that are on a wait list? Or how do you think about like very early foundational ways to engage with customers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's, it depends also on your market. If it's SMB and self-serve, if it's up market, those customers have different needs and different expectations for the kind of one-to-one type care they might want up market, or the self-serve that they might be sufficient with down market. So I think that's, one component. I think also your earliest customers are really different than your later customers for a lot of reasons. Early on, those people who are early adopters, who are on your wait list, they're going to have a different relationship with your CS team. They may be really partial to want to give product feedback because they were excited to join your beta. They would maybe natural in terms of adopting and learning things self-serve because they want all the reading materials. They want to read your release notes. They want to, watch your, webinar. They want to meet other power users and so on. And so you have some luxuries there that you want to tap into, because what you're doing is you're building your earliest champions and your earliest advocates. So what you're looking to do as a CS team there is empower those early customers to find success. Get some success stories out of there that you can use for marketing materials, get some referenceable customers that your go-to-market team can then use to find more new logos, but also really learn from them. You really want to open those product feedback loops so you can learn and improve during those early moments. And then it changes, later on when you go outbound with SDRs and BDRs and you're now knocking on people's doors to get them to evaluate your tool, that really changes the CS motion. You might face more resistance there. You might have to do more work to create executive relationships, multi-threaded relationships, instill a prescriptive CS methodology on customers. So that really changes. So I think, you have to think about your CS methodology really evolving as you move from waitlist and early beta customers into later cohorts of customers.
Makes sense. When you work with early stage companies, are you doing like tactically, are you building a customer journey? At what point do you start to think about segmentation or really starting to explore specific use cases? Or what are some early tactics that would be helpful for founders, I think, specifically as we start to think about like what should a first success hire look like, and do they own both sales and success, and what are some of the core systems and processes they should implement when they join?
Yeah, totally. So I think to think about all that, you have to first kind of go back to really basic things, and really an elementary way to look at this is what is the objective and what is the role of CS. And I think frankly, a lot of founders ask me like, I don't really understand why this is different than support, particularly when it's a product-led growth and you have, tons of users who love your product and will write in questions and so on. So let's start there and then break it down that way. So the way I define CS and how I see it differ from support or customer experience is the goal of CS and your CSMs is to be that bridge between the technology that you built, which is phenomenal, and the people that are customers who want to buy that technology. And their objective is to help those customers find success and value with the intention that they did when they first signed up, or they first signed that contract, or they first signed up for that trial. And the way that we want to measure that person in that team, therefore, is how well do they drive adoption, maturation, and value in the usage of your tool for your customers. There are lagging indicators of all those things that are more kind of like the metrics you'll like read on different blogs around like churn or NR or GRR or growth metrics. But the real focus that we should be holding your team accountable to and measuring them for is adoption, maturation, and value, especially early on when you may be so early that you don't have your first, annual renewals and so on to really measure. And then the second part is how is it different from support or customer experience? And that's in a few ways. Firstly, CS would be strategic and proactive motions that the customer team is taking, versus support should naturally be reactive and response-led, meaning there's inbound customer inquiries and break fix and so on. And the second is not all customers are equal, and that just happens as your customer base grows. And so for CS, they will define a subset of customers that they are going to have the most bang for their buck for you and working with. And so that could be a segment of customers, that could be a segment of users, versus for support, they treat all customers equally and all users equally in terms of you can write a ticket in and it will be resolved. But for CS, you might want to have those people who are really focused on a couple of key stakeholders like your executive sponsor, your economic decision maker, your admins, your champions, your power users, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the way I kind of frame, how you think about the directive and the objective of that team.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. It's interesting too, because you've raised an interesting point where I think the distinction between customer success and customer support is a really important one. I think especially as a company starts to move beyond a closed wait list and you start to have more key accounts, or even like the early path to target accounts, where there are certain companies in a category that you absolutely need using your product for future customer stories. And so I think it's a really interesting point. I wonder, at what point did Slack, or even Zendesk is also a great example, at what point does customer success start sizing specific accounts? What sort of data and product analytics do you use to actually identify like what warrants the type of customer that CS is willing to take on?
Yeah, sure. So I think to answer that, it's so different per company. Like the simplistic way would be to say do it by spend, but that doesn't work for all companies and all products. It certainly works for most, but what you're really trying to do there is find the proxy for what is the CSM's maximum workload. And so think about that this way. The hardest problem that your CSM should be solving for your customers that cannot be accomplished with software documentation is the thing you want them spending all their time on. And then you have to think about, well, what is the proxy for that? So for example, the reason why most companies, Slack included, do segmentation by ARR is because the more ARR a SaaS customer has, the more seats they've purchased. And the biggest challenge that the CSM is leading that customer through is adoption of those seats and launching those seats. And so it is a proxy of the amount of effort it will take to launch that customer successfully if they have high ARR and therefore a high number of seats. But that's not the case for all products. Some products might be more sticky or required. For example, Zendesk. So like if you buy Zendesk, you don't got to spend a ton of time on adoption because like it's the tool for your entire support team. So, once it's plugged in, everyone has to use it. And so therefore, there's other ways you could think about potentially dividing up your CSM's time. And so, for example, at Zendesk, the CSMs had different kind of like plays that they ran. They didn't own the customer accounts. They weren't attached to customer accounts. They were assigned by, in sales team, we call it DSR, a service request from the account rep to the CSM to say, hey, I need you to perform this play. And so those plays would be really specific things like help the customers with their insights and analytics or, XYZ. So you have to think about like, what is the biggest challenge you need that team solving that they're uniquely positioned to do? That you need humans to do and do well, and then what are the ways you measure that? And that's one way you can figure out of how you segment and cut your customers.
That makes sense. When it comes to measurement, at what point does it make sense to implement a customer health score? Because I think it's an area where oftentimes, I think especially with founder-led sales, it's awesome when you have a handful of customers or you're partnering with other YC companies or individuals that you know well. Like a founder-to-founder relationship is really strong because you can give honest feedback and you have a really close relationship already. At what point does it make sense to start building a customer health score? And more importantly, what should teams or founders do if that customer health score starts to drop?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I have lots of thoughts on health scores. I've seen health scores like really, frankly, like fall flat on their faces and not be used. And they can be very expensive and take a lot of time to develop. And people buy fancy tools and they employ, fancy people to design it. So I have lots of thoughts on this. So I think for customer health scoring, early on, it is helpful more so if you have a product with a more SMB type customer, and two, if you have a wide scale of customers. If you have a narrow patch of customers to start, and if you have really more upmarket enterprise customers, it may not be so helpful early on. And that is because each customer may be a more special snowflake. Your CSMs are probably in there, more embedded into the customer. And so their qualitative lens of things is probably outweighs what you could get from a thing like a customer health score. But if you have a huge, base of customers and that's the easiest way for you to kind of predictively model and know who's doing well, who's not, then certainly it can be helpful. Then there's a couple of like pitfalls I'll point out for what I've seen not work for customer health scoring. The first is when you have a single dimension on which you measure your customers. And so that means like a lot of teams, particularly product teams, will design, some kind of analytics thing and they'll bring that into Salesforce and it'll measure product usage and that will become the product health score, but that's one dimensional. And so that's a pitfall because it doesn't accurately give you a full picture. The inverse of that would be having a multi-dimensional health score that includes not only product usage, but also things like executive sponsorship, customer engagement with you company and the CSM team. That can include multi-threaded relationships. They can just have more components to it. The second kind of pitfall I've seen, which happens is you have like a binary scoring and it's either like a customer's red or green. And so all your customers are either in this like healthy or unhealthy bucket. And that doesn't give you like a lot of flavors to play with. And so the opposite of that would be having scoring that's more dynamic. So you can bucket customers into, it's in this range of score and also they are, meeting these other criteria. And thus, they're going to get this treatment. They're in this range of scores and they have this many traits and, this is how we treat them. So kind of dynamic scoring lets you kind of have different layers of what to do with that score. And then the most important pitfall is, you design a health score and you take the time to make it, but it just sits there and no one uses it because you haven't designed playbooks for what you want your team to do depending on what the score is. And so, of course, that's the most important thing. And it's surprising how often that happens. And we just have like a score that sits in Salesforce or Baseball or whatever, no one does anything with it. So alongside that scoring, you need to also have the bandwidth and the CS manpower and the CS experience for someone to develop playbooks for the good, the bad, and the ugly. So things like retention and risk and escalation playbooks, things like stakeholder mapping and multi-threaded engagement playbooks, and so on. And so kind of my short answer is, until you are ready to do that, I would almost suggest don't spend energy and time on that until you're ready to really make it meaningful for you as a team and as a company. And then you can dive into it. But oftentimes I talk to teams and they're not at a place where they even need to develop health scores, even though that's something that they think they need to do. But I think early on, it's so much about prioritization of where your team is putting in effort. And you have to really think about, is this a building block that needs to happen now, or is this a building block that can wait a little bit?
That's a really great point. When you first joined Slack, to what extent did you look at Lifecycle programs and email marketing and some of the other customer touch points that could have a good indication of, it's almost like a pre-customer health score?
Yeah, so our marketing team, was always doing that and had customer lifestyle marketing efforts, and our support team also had like tremendously thorough and detailed customer help documentation and so on. Because our self-serve business was so huge in our early years, that was always a critical component. So really when CS started at a kind of later junction in the company, we could lean on some of that for our customer base. And so our earliest scaled pooled campaigns could kind of lean and pull on some of that existing documentation from our marketing and support team. At a later stage, we started developing more of those things in-house in CS in scalable ways for customers. But the way we chose to do it was, for example, with our champions program or our success circle. So we'd have someone on our scale team lead a roundtable similar to this. It could have been a super peer, and it would have been with a couple dozen customers in our scaled pooled portfolio. And they would be talking about a specific use case or a specific challenge or highlighting a couple of customers. And we would let customers help each other. And that was something that we could do repeatedly. That was super value add, and our customers were delighted by and really loved, that we could do to kind of take it one level up and beyond like webinars and scalable content and marketing campaigns. And the other thing is we could measure customer engagement from that. So if you do kind of a scaled webinar campaign and you say you're going to have a success circle, we're going to talk about these things, and people click on it and they join, it tells you something about their engagement, their interest, what they're looking for from you. And so you can bucket that customer into one bucket, and the customers that don't, you can bucket them into another. So that's one example.
That's awesome. It reminds me a lot of the early days of Zendesk Support Leadership Forum, which later scaled into being Zendesk Relate, where it's like, can you bring together your best customers or your power users and essentially give them a format to have conversations and to get to know each other? And I think that's such an interesting model. And it feels like, especially for early stage startups, it is very scalable. I mean, even conversations like this, it's nice to just bring people together and have people in a room or over Zoom. When you think about, one of the things that I love that you're really great at is finding ways to pull the voice of the customer into product. Can you talk about what is the voice of the customer and how do you typically work with product teams both at Zendesk and at Slack?
Yeah, totally. This one is such a challenge for teams, truly. I think, oftentimes there is this kind of gap between the go-to-market and the product teams, and they speak different languages and they have different incentives, and it's hard to, form that bridge. So I can talk a little bit about how you can form that and how I thought about it, but also, starting with kind of why that is so important. I think one thing I learned from Slack and Zendesk and other, great companies is that the way that product and go-to-market teams work together can really be a competitive differentiator for you. It can be the reason why you're infinitely successful. And it can also be one of the reasons why you really struggle, particularly as your customer base changes and maybe you get into the outbound or you get into that market or whatever it might be. But the kind of marriage there is your product and go-to-market team should be working together to make your product adapt to the customer as much as it is making the customer adapt to your product. And so this bi-directional partnership that really makes your customer successful, which is why, when I start a new role and I go and meet people, beyond meeting everyone and go to market, like I really want to meet with product leadership. I want to understand their philosophy of customer success. I want to share with them mine, which is customer success is not the name of my team. It's the name of this company mission, and we're all in it together to make our customers successful. I want to know their experience in the past with customers, if they've been involved, if they've been customer facing, if they've really hated working with teams, if they've loved it, why. I really want to dig into all that to understand are there any challenges or red flags as I go and try to set up a great relationship here. And then I want us to be aligned on some of our joint roadmap plans together and some of the touch points that we're going to both collectively be involved with the customer. And so, there's some basic things that you'll want to put in place, like obviously, you need a mechanism to collect customer feedback, and you need to be able to track and prioritize that and surface up the product. That's kind of like table stakes. But there's other things that you can also layer upon that to build and voice to the customer. It can be things like, do you have an amazing beta program or a user research program where if, a researcher or a product manager or, the engineering lead on a certain project or initiative or feature, do they have a way to access customers to get input, and is it structured that way? And, can the CSM team really provide a benefit to the product team as they, work on that thing. It can also be, easy wins are repeatable ways to involve product in a scalable way in customer conversations, which is like, can you pull them into certain calls? Can they sit on EVRs and present the roadmap and hear firsthand from customers on their feedback? Can they be involved in the customer advisory board or Zendesk Relate forums and meet a bunch of customers at scale? So, just ways that you can really build that bridge and make sure that the customer's voice is being heard and echoed for the product team. Those things are super important to do early on.
That's great. Thank you so much for this. I want to hand it over. We have a bunch of people on the call and some individuals had questions ahead of time as well. And so feel free, if anyone has any questions for Linda, feel free to jump in.
I don't bite.
I got a question. Can y'all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Rajiv.
Hey. Hi, Brianne. Hi, Linda. So let's see. My company Tandem's a virtual office for remote teams. So, of course, bottoms-up adoption, very similar to Slack. It starts with a team and expands from there. Mm-hmm. But did Slack also do top-down enterprise pilots in the early days? And what did the playbook for those look like, when it's really, you're kind of feeling it out and maybe you're not sure it's going to succeed, and it's like the first few enterprise pilots?
Thank you for your question, first of all, Rajiv, and being brave enough to go first. I think that's a great question. We did, and truthfully, we really struggled with it. So we tried it a couple different ways with a couple different owners. And I was there for our first enterprise pilots because I joined prior to our launching of our enterprise grid product. And so at first, we had CSMs running point on those pilots. We later on transitioned that to our solutions engineers, who are kind of our pre-sales technical art of the possible people. But anywho, early lessons from that, we didn't really know what we were doing. We were like, well, we give them the access, and then they tell us how they use it, and then we shape our playbook. That's how it works, right? And what we learned is we really needed to define the pilot process when it was top-down in enterprise, because this is not a bottoms-up motion. You're now working, in our case, through the CIO. It's a centralized decision. They want to know at the end of the pilot a answer, right? They're making a decision. They're deciding to go or no go. And so they need a lot of things for that. The first is that we needed to make it time-bound. And then we need to think strategically about how much time is appropriate. And then we need to be really prescriptive. Like, if you're going to do this time bound, then by day 1, by day 2, by day 3, by week 3, here are the expectations of where we need to be in order for you to get a good pilot experience. And then we needed to think about metrics. How are we going to measure this pilot? Is it a qualitative thing, like you felt like it was great and you liked it and your users liked it, so you buy? Or do we need other hard metrics around the value that you distill during this time or certain usage trends? We needed to define those metrics of pilot success. And then the last thing, which is the thing that we learned the hard way, is it's really hard to develop behavioral change in a pilot. So when you have a team of 100 engineers, and you say, hey, we're going to pilot Slack for you because our CIO is going to test this out. So we're going to flip it on Tuesday. You get 30 days to trial it, leave Teams and Jabber and come work in here and then tell us how you like it. And we decide if we're going or no going, but change everything about the way that you work for those 30 days. That's a hard ask to stomach. So there's a lot of change management that needs to happen that we discovered for a Slack pilot to be successful, to get people to agree to change the way that they work for a short amount of time, for a thing that they're really not incentivized, to perhaps want to take part of. And so those were all lessons we kind of learned the hard way with our earliest pilots. And we had to really tweak and refine our playbook for pilots, figure out the right owner, the right prescriptive playbook, the right time frame, the right metrics, and the right approach for that.
What were some things that you did to course correct if adoption is not quite, or if there's resistance in the middle of the pilot?
Yeah, totally. So one of the big things is having great executive sponsorship, meaning for example, if it's a dev team, they need to be told by their VP of engineering that this is something that's important, that they really want everyone involved in. They need to be kind of prescriptively told a vision and how they're expected to behave here, right? And they need to hear it not from the Slack CSM or from the CIO, but from their own line management. So having executive sponsorship is really important. The second thing is, it sounds like you're also bottoms up product. So you have champions and you need to tap into that. So for a pilot, the people that were really excited about Tandem, or in this case Slack, you want to involve them, ask them, how can this be successful for your team? What would work for your teammates? How can we make them excited about this? And so, for example, I went on site to Home Depot, which is one of our earliest pilot customers, and we did a round of lightning talks. And we would have developers who were champions of Slack present for 5 minutes to their peers in small group settings all across campus, what they were achieving, what kind of bots they had built, what kind of automations were changing their lives. And we had champions excite their own peers. And we gave a lot of swag because they were like, that's going to work for us. People will come for the swag. So, there's just things that you just tap into through your champions to understand how to make this pilot successful for this particular customer and their culture. I think those are, two really important components.
I'll jump in. We have a couple of people on the line that are currently very early in doing paid pilots. What's been your experience on how do you structure those? To what extent should you discount or really put customer success resources against even free pilots to close larger logos and to start to pull your product into more mid-market and enterprise?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question. We battled this as well. You have to make a decision at some point if you want to do paid versus free pilots. You have to make a decision if you want it to be part of your go-to-market motion. For some products, it makes sense. And for other products, it doesn't. It's like it can actually be a barrier to entry. And for some products, it's an accelerant. It really is the thing that you need to push your customers over the edge. And then there's another question around how do you resource it? So at Slack early on, we did have CSMs involved in pilots, as I mentioned, for paid pilots. And that was because we needed all hands on deck. We didn't have any enterprise customers. We needed to get them. So all hands on deck. We had the change management experts and adoption experts, really helping make pilots successful. But as we started to bring on those customers and they were converting to real customers and they were paid customers, we had to make a different judgment call, which is, hey, we actually want to define the customers that CSMs work with as paid customers of the enterprise product. And so we're going to pass pilots back to sales and pass back to solutions engineers who are meant to help in the pre-sales motion. So the ownership changed over time and evolved over time. for us. And so it's okay if that's the case, if the swim lanes are a little bit gray in the beginning and it's just all hands on deck. But as time goes on, you kind of evolve the ownership of pilots. Did I answer the majority of the points? I feel like I missed a few things you mentioned.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Another question that I've been thinking a lot about is, for a lot of companies that start more bottom up, it's easy to find your champion. The champion is the person that's using the product every day. From the customer success side of things, what are tactics and playbooks that you've implemented to get more manager level exposure? Like there's ways to land and expand from team to team, but how do you actually take a product that's used by, say, engineers on a daily basis? What would be playbooks or tactics to really get the product exposed to a VP of engineering and convert them to a champion as well?
Yeah, totally. This is definitely a challenge we face at Slack, and I think a lot of CS teams face this challenge, especially in product-led growth, where there's this kind of groundswell of user love, and you have certain people that early embrace it or love to use it, but then you have decision makers at the top who don't care, who maybe don't do their day-to-day in that tool, or who maybe are too busy to even think about this. And so how do you get them involved, and what's the right point to get them involved? And these also might be people who just naturally are more resistant to change, more resistant to new technology. They don't necessarily care about using cloud tools or best and free tools or whatever. And they have little time. So there's not a lot of bandwidth to get in front of them or convince them or so on. So I think you have to really think critically about, what is the right way to get in front of those people? And then what are your asks going to be of them? For Slack, for example, if we're doing a launch, we will have literally a slide we put in front of the customer, and it'll say success criteria, and we will voice that over and we'll say, there are things that we've identified that all of our top successful customers have in common, and these are things we want to work with you to make sure you have. And the first is visible executive sponsorship. And the way we mean that by that is not you as the VP of engineering bless that your team can use Slack. That's not it. We want you literally moving your work into Slack, because if you're not using Slack to communicate, if you're still using email to blast your team, they're going to take that as a cue. People want to work with it where their managers and their leaders are working, and especially in obviously a collaboration tool, that's so important. So we're going to ask that you get involved. And so we'll make it easy for them. We'll say, well, what are easy wins? And so, for example, in the engineering world, because of Reddit and so on, people are really familiar with the concept of the AMA. So early on, we would say, well, here's what we'd love to do. Let's make it really easy for you. It's not realistic. You're in Slack every day and you're going to know, all the features and so on. But why don't we, on the day that we launch this, have you do a 1-hour AMA in a Slack channel? Your team can ask you questions and you can answer them. And we'll do something small like that is just a little bit of a teaser and an easy shared win where we can involve the leadership, but it's something that's very doable for them. And so that doesn't apply to everyone's products, but I think the lesson there is, just still the easiest way you can get those line of business leaders involved and ways you can make it feel bite-sized for them, but also be really prescriptive and tell them that this is necessary and get their buy-in and to agree to it.
I love the scalability of hosting AMAs as well. I think that's a nice way of really handing the over to individual users inside of the company and giving them a nice, turning them from not only a Slack champion, but into someone that's the known Slack expert inside of a company. That makes people feel good, and it's also scalable, where then they can answer a lot of the questions that come up over time, and they can host a lot of future conversations as well. I think that's a great way to even build more, build an internal community around Slack and to start to think through even how does this impact the broader team's culture.
Mm-hmm.
I had a really quick question. This is Michael from WorkOS. Today, the way we do support and success is pretty technical, since we end up building a product that's an API. We work with engineers, and we have a team of developer success engineers. Excuse me, developer success engineers that help people plug this in and do the tactical, actual wiring up. A lot of the new product features come from those conversations. It's sort of the absolute best channel for hearing about what's new. And we don't have any PMs. And I'm sort of the liaison between these two systems. It's extraordinarily valuable because those people have their finger on the pulse of where the product should go, what the defects are, and even what the advantages of using it are. Have you found any way to kind of harness that as it scales, or provide a channel for that to more broadly broadcast across the whole organization? Maybe both, like thinking about it both in terms of tactical stuff with specific product changes that you want to make versus just here's like the voice of the customer, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Michael. Yeah, I think with a technical tool where it has to be so hands-on, that makes sense that you might actually be in some of those live conversations. I mean, there's also, if you don't have the time and bandwidth, there's also more scalable ways. For example, a lot of people at teams I know now, they implement Gong, and they will use like a Gong snippet to send into a Slack channel, and that way their engineering teams can firsthand read or watch the transcript or watch the video for just that 1 minute where the customer's talking about a specific thing that they want to call attention to. I think, think really scrappy. It doesn't need to be a Salesforce object or whatnot early on. It can be a spreadsheet, it can be a Slack channel, just a place where you can collectively put all of those great ideas you're hearing from customers. In the beginning, we actually had a channel at Slack that we called the features channel, and we would just have people from all over support, engineering, CS, would just dump ideas. But we did have a short framework, kind of like a template of what we wanted, because you don't just want it to be in any kind of format. You want like the problem statement, what are we trying to solve here, the impact that this could have, the scope that this could have, meaning is this something that many customers would benefit from, or just one use case or whatever. Impact could be like, does it unlock a new use case for us, a new type of customer? Is it a showstopper versus a nice to have? Does it drive stickiness? Does it, what does it do? And then, example customers, and then you can have other people pile on. So if you have, technical enablement people that are working with all these API customers, and they're seeing some repeated trends, they can go and pile on top and say, actually, like +1 for, also this customer said the same thing. And then over time, what you'll see is some aggregate trends. So on a monthly or quarterly basis, somebody needs to be responsible for reviewing all the feature input or requests that have come in, figuring out which ones have been thematic and tied together, figure out which ones have been consistently high impact and high scope, and then prioritize those. So you have a clean list of like, okay, well, out of all the things we've had this month, like here are the 3 that we should maybe consider on the roadmap, and then, bring that to you to say, would these make sense in our roadmap? What would be the trade-offs we would make, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say, you can rotate it, but you might make it round robin, but give someone ownership of something as simple as you're responsible on the last, Monday of every month to comb through this channel and come up with a short list of the top 3 things we should consider, bringing that to our, our next stand up to discuss.
Oh, Brianne, I think you're muted.
Sorry, guys, I was on mute. So question, there's quite a few in the chat around KPIs. And so it would be awesome to hear how you think about logo retention, dollar retention, to what extent are there shared KPIs for product and customer success? And what does that even look like on the documentation level?
Oh, whoa, my mind is blown. I just discovered that there's a chat. Okay, well, let me go back and read the question again. Shared KPI for product and CS teams. Okay, yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think, shared KPIs is always a way to motivate and incentivize team. I've actually not seen this done before outside of having maybe broader shared OKRs. So, for example, at Slack, when we launched Slack Connect, which was a big bet of recent times and the big feature we wanted to build, that was a shared OKR across all of the teams at Slack. So every department needed to have projects and initiatives that they were going to do to help drive the success of Slack Connect. So in that way, it is a shared KPI, right? It's a shared goal that you have to achieve a certain percentage of your customers using that feature or whatever. And then every team has a way they contribute to that. And those things can be different from team to team. So for example, in the CS team, it might be, I'm going to own my part of this by driving a certain amount of customers that beta that product, or I'm going to own part of this by making sure I talk to X percentage of my customers about that within, the X number of weeks. So I think that definitely makes sense. But I think to make it impactful, you have to really limit where you do that for your biggest bets. So you want to align people at certain pivotal times in the company in year around your big bets. So don't just do it for the small ones because it might dilute kind of the impactfulness of that because there's so many, great features and so on that you're going to be launching.
Awesome. Any more questions for Linda?
I see a few here. I didn't see them before, but there's one around KPIs for CSMs. So I talked about this a little bit before, but yes, definitely retention should be one, but retention is really a lagging indicator. So while you might comp someone or comp a team on a gross retention number, you really want to measure their day-to-day and quarter-on-quarter activity by the things I talked about, so adoption, maturity, and value, which are going to have maybe softer metrics or maybe different metrics, because those are the things that will lead to great retention. To your question around logo versus dollar, I think usually it makes sense to look at your dollar retention and in particular gross dollar retention rather than net. Net meaning includes expansion, especially early on when you're still in growth phase, because that gives you a true metric of the customers you're actually retaining versus maybe a more blended metric of you're growing some, but you're losing some, but you're bringing in new ones and so on. Logo retention might matter depending on your situation, but in some cases it's not always the most important thing because there are some customers early on that are just bad customers, and you kind of build in the understanding that you're going to lose those kind of early bad customers, and logo retention isn't the top thing. You want to retain, more importantly, around ARR. And then Boris, to your question on whether CSMs should own upsells. That's a great question. That's one I get a lot, and there's no silver bullet answer. It depends on a lot of things. So some CS teams do own upsells, some CS teams do own renewal, and then some CS teams do not. So it just depends. So I'll just give you kind of an example so you understand kind of the framing you would need to think about this, and you have to apply it to your own product, your own company. For Slack, the business model is land and expand. And so if you sell to Amazon and you have a 5,000 person deployment, you're really just tip of the iceberg, right? And you really want to get to 500,000 users. And so in that case, because it's land and expand in terms of seats, you want the AE to own the customer forever because they're building a relationship with the CIO and the executives, and you want them to continue to drive that and have more expansion. And so in that case, it doesn't make sense for the CSM to own upsell. In another case, you have a product which is like Zendesk, which is more of a plug and play product. It's not deeply enterprise. There's only one set of users, and the support team buys it. The way that Zendesk would make money is one of two ways. You either add more SKUs and you sell the customer more SKUs, or you elevate their planship, right? So you go from standard, basic to standard to enterprise to whatever else we call it. In that case, it makes sense for the CSM, or actually in the case of Zendesk, we had account managers, which is my team. The account manager owns the upsell, not the original AE, because once the AE sells to the support team, you pay them their comp, they go on to net new logos, and then the AM has time to work with that customer on upgrading their plan type based on what they know about the customer, or helping them understand different SKUs and how that might benefit them, and adding that to their plan. And so that commercial element then passes to post-sales because it makes sense. But again, that's a very different business model than Slack. So it can be either, Boris, but it just depends on your business model. And you basically have to think about who is best suited to help the customer through that. The other thing you have to keep in mind is it's expensive to have, different people own this, because there's a cost to having your AEs own upsell, which is that they're not bringing in net new logos. And also we're paying them a hefty commission. So you have to think about that kind of trade-off when you think about kind of ownership of expansion.
It's interesting that you brought up AEs plus CSMs. How do you think about team planning and compensation, and what are some of the trade-offs in some of those models? Because I think to start, oftentimes with early stage companies, you may have a couple of individuals on post sales and they sort of straddle the AE and CSM world for a while. But as you start to build out the team, how do you think about like specific KPIs and realistically compensation for both?
Yeah, totally. Like all things that I've talked about, it just needs to evolve as your team changes. So just to give an example, at Slack, we changed the way that we comp CSMs and also AEs every year, I'd say. So multiple times. That's a lot of comp changes when you're rolling it out to a field team. But we did that because the focus of our teams were different as we went. So like I mentioned, I think earlier, at the beginning, we had CSMs involved in basically pre-sale. So we had a small part of their comp that was actually around ACV, which was the same as AE. So we have a piece that's overlapping into, I think Boris's point earlier, shared KPIs. That changed over time. Then a year later, we pulled them out of that. We wanted them to focus on adoption. So maybe we flip that and we talk about some kind of adoption triggered thing, like, expanding ARR within existing customers. So we would change what we would comp them on. We would change the KPIs that they're responsible for. And so that just happened every year. And there's many other different examples. So, I mean, the North Stars of your comp plan they should be incentivizing the behavior you need to drive for meeting your company's objectives at that particular time. And they need to be incentivizing the behavior you want from the team, whether that is team selling, which is something we would focus on at one point, or whether that is having your own swim lanes and doing what your team uniquely can do for the customers, and so on. And then the third part is it has to be something controllable by that team. You can't comp them and have them be motivated by it if they feel like this is totally out of their control. So something that they can really drive. Those are all important components when you think about comp and KPIs.
That makes sense. 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up, Linda. Question from Nina, who's building a developer platform that starts more bottoms up. Are there any developer platforms with standout customer success programs? And what are some examples that you've seen work well, I think specifically for a developer buyer?
I can't, now you're putting me on the spot. I can't name like one particular company, but I think the thing with developer platforms is developers are either like really loyal, they like love you or they hate you, I find. So they can be great to tap into for the champions model, Nina. So I think that was a good learning we had. Our earliest users of Slack were developers. And so they were really powerful because they are extremely loyal for products that they love that make their work more efficient because they have very complicated work. They will push their internal executives to buy the tools that they need, and they will champion that bottoms-up growth upwards and demand that. We even have developers that would say, like, if you don't have Slack, I won't work here. Like, that's a requirement for me to work here. So they can be really powerful champions to fire up. And they also give good product feedback, but you have to give them the opportunity for that. So think about making sure they have the avenues to shape your product because that feels important to them. They want to have that kind of buy-in and have that kind of relationship with your company. So I think those are some general lessons, I'd say, from the dev world.
Did the customer success team play an active role in the apps marketplace and in some of the developer first integrations, or to what extent were you able to lean into some of the programs that were being built specifically for developers inside Slack?
Not not really a one-to-one involvement. I think part of the CSM's job there is to make sure your customers, based on their use case, know how to get the most out of the platform. So when we talk about maturation of Slack usage, that basically means tapping into the platform, and that basically means tapping into apps. And so for development teams, it would be making sure they know and are aware and have other customer success stories so that they are using the right integrations and apps. And then also making sure they have access, like putting them in touch with our DevRel team or our TCSM or technical CSM team. So if they want to build something custom, a custom integration, that they have the right technical resources to help them, make sure that's successful. So that was more the involvement.
That makes sense. One more final question for Mujeeb. Thinking about qualitative insights, especially for early stage companies, at what point do surveys become helpful, and how do you think about, the total number of responses to really get a quality signal?
Yeah. Honestly, I lean on your research team for their thoughts on this in general. I think that, NPS can be really tricky to get a good signal from. So for Slack, for example, in the early days, we didn't lean on it that much. We certainly collected NPS, but it wasn't telling us that many signals when the majority of our customers loved the product and would refer it, right? And there were some users that weren't, but what do we do with that as a CSM team? We're not going to have a CSM call every person that puts in a 4 and say why, right? So it was only helpful for us if it was certain types of stakeholders who were giving low NPS. I think that is different as a metric to, for example, CSAT. So measuring their satisfaction with a certain customer success motion. So like if they just finished a migration to our enterprise product and we survey them and they say, I hated that experience, it was awful, I would never do it again, I wish I'd never done it. That's different. That matters. That's feedback we can action. That's feedback we need to know. And so I think it just depends on what you're trying to learn from it and who you're hearing that response from.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much for going the whole hour. This has been really fun. It's been great to hear about your journey at Zendesk and Slack and all of the great work that you've been doing with early stage companies as well. So thanks so much for sharing some of your playbooks. And following this, we'll have an on-demand recording of the conversation. We're also going to document a lot of the best practices that you shared. And so we'll turn that into a blog post as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was super fun. And feel free to reach out to me, anyone that's on the call on LinkedIn, if you have other questions, or get my email from Bree. Love to stay in touch. And yeah, really loved meeting everyone.
Awesome. Thanks again. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.